It's 1996, and the Tampa Bay Storm are at the height of their power. 4 titles in 6 years has shown the arena football world who's the real big dog. The Storm has reached devastating levels, sweeping up houses and pummeling the land with bullet rain. It seemed like there was nothing that could be done to stop them, but in an instant that all changed. Jay Gruden, the man who led this team up to dynasty status, and perhaps the greatest quarterback in arena football history, retired at the mountaintop. Can't really blame him, he got all he wanted and more, but that left the Storm in a weird spot. They had to rely on their new quarterback, Peter Willis, who was a former NFL player with the Bears. Sure enough, he turned out to be pretty good, as he threw for over 2,800 yards and 41 touchdowns, despite having to miss some time due to broken ribs. But it wasn't enough to perpetuate their dominance, as the '97 Storm took a noticeable hit in a rough season. After starting 3-1, they would lose 4 of their next 5, including getting slapped by Orlando, who would sweep them. They would rebound by finishing the season with winning 4 of their last 5, but they would still enter the playoffs as only the number 6 seed. That paired them against the new expansion team Nashville Cats. But the Storm were eager to show their veteran resolve, as they would score on every possession in the first half, taking a 38-21 lead. The Cats would push back, scoring 21 points in the fourth alone, but the Storm were able to hold on for a close win. In the semifinals, they once again faced Arizona, whom they beat the year before and in the season opener a few months prior. However, the Rattlers were looking to reassert themselves among the league's elite, and the tone would be set early as their defense would hold strong to start the game, and their offense would take them to an early lead. But the Storm still had some grit to them, namely on their special teams with this kick return score. They would go back and forth, but the Storm would find themselves down 21-16 at the half. They would push back with a vengeance as they flew down the field with only 3 plays to take the lead. But Arizona would answer right back. Kicker Rich Fall would have his work cut out for him, as he would make 4 field goals as the team was still having trouble getting past Arizona's defense. Nonetheless, they remained tied at 36 heading into the fourth. Arizona would strike again to go up 43-36, but quarterback Cedric Bonner's leg would be broken on the play. Suddenly, the Rattlers' season was in jeopardy, and sure enough, the Storm would answer back to tie the game again, and they would bully the Arizona backup to keep things close. With about 6 minutes left, the Rattlers had the chance to jump back out, but their kick would go wide, giving the Storm the perfect chance to end this game as they marched to the goal line. But once again, they would be foiled by the Arizona defense, as the pass would be picked off in the end zone. Luckily, the Rattlers would miss another field goal, and the game would head into overtime, where Tampa would get the ball first. And, as was the theme of this game, the Storm would get deep in Arizona territory again, and couldn't complete the drive, settling for a field goal. But all it took was one play to shut down Tampa's hope for a three-peat. 1997 was the beginning of a change in Storm history, if the resulting season wasn't enough to go off of. Sure, they were still great, but teams like Orlando and Arizona were proving to be formidable opponents, and the Storm would really have to work to earn their 5th title. Now they even had a new place to play, as they would leave the newly dubbed Tropicana Field to open the Ice Palace with the Lightning. It's okay. I understand having to leave America's ballpark for a facility that's definitely better suited for arena football. Good thing the Trop has remained to stand tall as they would welcome their new baseball team. Man, I sure hope nothing bad happens to that stadium in the next 26 or so years. Well, the Storm would look to right the ship in '98, with their now Hall of Fame coach Tim Markham looking to bounce back after not making the Arena Bowl for the first time. They would run into some trouble, as the Cats would get revenge for 97 with 4 turnovers to capture a win, in front of only 9,629 fans, the smallest crowd for a Storm game so far. Don't worry, surely it won't get worse. No matter, as they would go on to win 9 in a row, including whooping Orlando twice and crushing New Jersey 81-45. Milestones would be made, as LaFrance would reach 1,000 points scored and 500 receptions, and rusher Les Bartley would become the first 1,000-yard rusher in league history. They would also retire Gruden's number, becoming the first in their franchise. However, the season would be soured by losing to Nashville again in an ugly affair that saw the Storm take 15 penalties and suffer 5 turnovers. 2 players, Wayne Walker and Cedric McKinnon, would be suspended for 1 year after testing positive for the Devil's Lettuce. But the Storm were still seen as one of the top teams once again, with the best record in the league. They had the number 1 offense and the number 1 defense, with guys like Johnny Harris and Wayne Wyatt leading the way. Willis would throw 70 touchdowns, Barley and LaFrance would continue to be elite, Barkham was once again the coach of the year. Man, this might be the best Storm team we've seen yet. They showed it in the first round against San Jose, who limped into the Ice Palace only to get run out the door, as the Storm would score on their first 9 possessions, crushing them 65-46. New Jersey wouldn't fare much better, as despite jumping out to a 10-0 lead early, the looming Storm would strike back, outscoring them 49-13 to end the game in convincing fashion. After taking a year off to reform, Tampa Bay seemed to be back once again to terrorize the league. And sure enough, they would once more face an old foe in the Arena Bowl. The Orlando Predators, just like in '95, bullshitted their way here again, even beating Arizona in the semis. But this year was different, as they were in their first season with their new coach, someone Tampa fans know very well. Jay Gruden, after taking a year off in '97, would sign on to be the Preds coach in '98, and would lead them to a 9-5 campaign in his first year. He would remark on how it was a great opportunity, although he knew people from Tampa would see him as a traitor. But the Storm were still able to show them who's boss by beating Orlando both times in the regular season. And as 17,000 fans packed into the Ice Palace, this game looked to be no different, as LaFrance would catch 2 scores to get the Storm in front.
No, they give it to Rick Hamilton, who does a great job of breaking free. He's got nothing but running room, a great downfield block on the part of Robert Gordon, and Rick Hamilton, who was just voted to the All-Rookie team in 1998.
But tied at 17 in the second, it suddenly seemed like Tampa Bay had hit their kryptonite, as Willis would devolve into a catastrophic outing, throwing 6 picks as they gave up 30 unanswered in what would become the worst loss in franchise history, including a missed field goal being returned for a touchdown. A 62-31 ass-whooping in the biggest game of the season, where the Storm lost their first home playoff game after winning their last 10, and lost their first Arena Bowl, all to their most hated rivals. It was a gut punch for sure, and to add insult to injury, they would lose more key players in the offseason, with Harris leaving for the NFL. They still seemed to be reeling from that loss, as they would drop the opening game of the '99 season due to bad time management. But they would proceed to rattle off another solid campaign, and once again trounce Orlando twice. And yeah, I know I'm sounding like a broken record at this point, but despite some regressions, the Storm were the best team in the league again. Surely, this time, This time, they can make another run to championship number 5. Motherfucker! The Predators walked into Tampa again, and the Storm would take an early lead again, shutting them out in the first half. And once again, they would completely shit themselves, giving up 41 points in the second half. All that goddamn work just to get crushed in the playoffs by Orlando. Again. The Storm had grown so much, it was beginning to tear itself apart. And to make matters worse, rumblings began to emerge of the team potentially moving to Oklahoma City. Kern had reported that the team was basically bleeding money, and they would only average around 10,000 fans per game in '99, their lowest so far. Tampa sports and attendance troubles. Truly an iconic duo. There was even talk of Tampa receiving another expansion team after the Storm left, which would be a nice kick in the balls. But Markham remained adamant, saying the team wasn't going anywhere. And sure enough, in late August, the Palace Sports and Entertainment Group, who already owned the Lightning and the Ice Palace, would purchase a minority stake in the team and keep the Storm in Tampa for the foreseeable future. However, their troubles weren't over yet, as now the Storm had to worry about if the 2000 season was even going to happen, as labor disputes would halt the league, with players demanding better pay. It got so bad that they would file an antitrust lawsuit against the owners, who would respond by voting to cancel the season. However, a week later, an agreement was made with the AFL Players Organizing Committee being recognized, and the 2000 season was back on. But things looked to be very different for the Storm, as Thomas and Perkins would leave, Willis would retire, Barley missed camp, Bembry would sign elsewhere, Wyatt would leave in the expansion draft, and LaFrance would be traded. Isn't that just awesome? Right after rumors of moving the team got settled, everybody just got up and left. That left the 2000 Storm with a bunch of randoms, as even when they tried to bring in quarterback Mike Perez, he would shortly decide to retire as well, effectively making that whole ordeal worthless. And so, their new quarterback would be Florida State alum Thad Busby. Ironic, when they were celebrating their 10th anniversary, they formed an all-decade team with a bunch of players who just left the team mere months ago. Unsurprisingly, the 2000 Storm struggled hard as they would go 1-4 to open the year, including getting thumped 67-34 by Albany. Backup John Kaleo would at least get them their first win, but another loss against Orlando had their season in peril. However, Kaleo would help pull his team out of the gutter with the win against LaFrance and the Red Dogs, and an overwhelming 77-26 win against Florida that saw Markham win his 100th regular season game to enter the bye at 3-5. 2 more wins would get them back to 500, and playing another big game against Orlando, the Storm would post 30 in the fourth to get themselves back in the playoff picture, which ultimately they would return to as their season turned around to finish 8-6 after starting 1-4. Sure, this was probably the worst Storm team yet, but hey, attendance was up. In the newly expanded playoffs, the Storm were sent to the wildcard round against Milwaukee, where an offensive shootout resulted in Tampa escaping with a 72-64 win. But, for the 3rd straight season, their run would end at the hands of the Predators. And yeah, it wasn't even close. Tampa had their chances. They had 3 drives go up to the goal line, yet they came away with nothing, and Orlando would handily defeat them en route to their 3rd title. In 1987, the AFL had only 4 teams to its name. 14 years later, that number had jumped to 19, spanning all across the country, and even now having a Toronto franchise. It was the most teams they've ever had and will ever have, as, spoiler alert, 4 of them would fold after 2001. But it showed that the AFL was still very much alive and thriving, something that other spring leagues can only dream of. The other inaugural teams, the Chicago Bruisers, Washington Commandos, and Denver Dynamite, were all long gone, with new teams in the cities that once held them. Even the Detroit Drive, who was the first real dynasty of the AFL, was gone, folding after losing to the Storm in the '93 Arena Bowl. The Storm were the last remnant of the original AFL, even though they were far away from where they started in Pittsburgh. Yet 14 years later, they still remained as one of the best teams in the league, as with Kaleo improving in his second season, and Andre and James Bowden helping to propel the offense, the team would jump out to a 7-0 start, but they would find themselves coming up short against their two rivals, Orlando and Arizona. Ever since '97, the war on I-4 had been pretty much even, with the Predators winning the games that mattered. They led the overall standings 15-13, but funnily enough, they both lost the division to Nashville, and the Storm would settle for second at 10-4. Not that it mattered, as they would be once again ass-blasted in the first round, though at least it wasn't against Orlando. Following 2 seasons of playoff incompetence and relocation rumors, Kern would officially sell the team in March 2002. Well, I say officially, as Thomas Hopper would pitch a deal of $12 million, but he would only pay around $1.6 million by the end of the '02 season, and so Kern would be reinstated as the team owner. Sure enough, a few years later, he was found guilty of wire fraud charges when trying to buy the team, and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Just great. Continuing the trend of the Storm being stupid, they let go of both Bowdens and a whole slew of other guys, resulting in basically a brand new team. And to make things even better, in the first game of the season, Kaleo would go down with a season-ending knee injury. The ensuing season was, let's just say, not good. They lost 5 of their first 6, then somehow scraped together 2 wins against Indiana and Orlando, then lost 3 of their next 4, and sat at 4-8 with 2 games left. At least they got to dunk on Gruden, who was back in uniform playing for Orlando now. But the season still looked like a lost cause. In week 13, they would get shit on early in Detroit, going down 21-0. But the Storm, now with their new quarterback Shane Stafford, would chip away, eventually tying the game early in the third. From there, it went back and forth, with the defense allowing 2 kick return scores. Fucking hell. But somehow, the Storm were able to stay in it, as David Saunders would catch the 4th down pass to seal the win. Against Georgia to end the season, it would turn into a shootout, as lots of scoring and missed kicks had the game tied heading into overtime, where David White would end it to finish the season at 6-8. Their first losing record since when they were still in Pittsburgh. God, what an ugly year. But good thing it's over, right? Wait, this team made the playoffs? Yeah, somehow everyone else just sucked more, and the Storm got in with the final spot. I guess if there's one thing we can gain from this, it's that they kept their playoff streak alive. But what's the point if they're just gonna get crushed in the first round anyway? Wait, they're winning? Yeah, against Los Angeles, the Storm were able to jump out early and not look back, as they won comfortably. The first time a 12 seed won a playoff game. Well, okay then. Their momentum would somehow continue against top-seeded San Jose, where Saunders would ball out once again as they held a 45-27 lead midway through the third. But they would run out of gas, as San Jose would score 21 unanswered. They kept fighting until the end, as they were only down one score late, but Stafford and the offense weren't able to finish it, and they would lose 55-48. It's been 7 years since their last title in '96, and the Storm still remained far away from their past glory. Shit, even the entire league was starting to struggle, as Tampa would lose $700,000 in 2002. It seemed like the best days of the Storm were behind them, but with Markham still here looking to turn things around, Kaleo coming back, the return of Lawrence Samuels, and signings like B.J. Cohen, Gary Compton, and Omar Smith, the Tampa Bay Storm looked to be brewing once again. On the first play of the season, Keita Crespinha would pick off Carolina for a score, the first of 5 times en route to a 60-20 beating. But once again, they found trouble in Orlando, as the Storm got screwed repeatedly by the officials, with 3 turnovers being overruled. The Predators exploded in the second with 23 points, and while Tampa was able to somewhat keep up, they would come up short again. Another heartbreaker against Vegas had them sitting at 1-2, but unlike the previous year, this team had some bite to them. They would go on a tear, outlasting Grand Rapids and Detroit, getting their revenge on Orlando, and crushing Arizona as they won 8 games in a row. They would finish 12-4 in the newly expanded 16-game schedule, granting them the second seed in the playoffs, where they looked to settle unfinished business. Against Detroit, it was a wild affair, with 12 lead changes as Kaleo and Freddie Solomon did their best to keep up. 2 kick return scores burned them, but Tampa found themselves up 52-48, where this time they would hold strong, as a pick from Omar Smith secured the win. But that only left them facing the goddamn Predators again. Gruden, now the Orlando quarterback, was no stranger to big games, but this one was different, as he was now on the field against the team he once led. He would draw first blood with an early 14-6 lead, but the Storm would score 27 in the second to go up 33-31 at the half. Solomon and Antoine Tolliver would record 2 scores each, and the lead would continue to grow, getting up to 47-31. Orlando would pull back to within 3, but Basil Proctor would get his second touchdown to restore the 2-score lead. A pick in the end zone from Cliff Dell should have been the end, but the offense wasn't able to get anywhere, and Gruden would get the ball back with little time left. But finally, the Storm would get their revenge, as Tolliver would pick off Gruden to shut down their rivals for good. And so they returned to the Arena Bowl for the 6th time in their history, and would also have a rematch against the Arizona Rattlers. This time, however, they had the luxury of playing at home in front of over 20,000 fans, the most people who've ever attended an Arena Bowl that wasn't played at the Trop. And unlike previously, where Bonner was able to get his team out in front early, things would quickly swing in the other direction, as Arizona would commit 5 turnovers. However, the Storm still only held a 1-score lead at the break, and to make matters worse, Kaleo had to leave the game due to a sprained back. Just like how Arizona had to sub in their backup 6 years prior, Tampa did the same with Pat O'Hara, who'd only thrown 14 passes all season. But he wouldn't falter, as both teams would trade scores into the 4th, and Lord Samuels would get open with this huge pass to further boost the lead. He would record 3 scores and 109 yards, easily winning him both the MVP and the Iron Man award, as the Storm held on for a 43-29 win. Just a few months after the Bucks hoisted their first Lombardi trophy, the Storm would win their 5th Arena Bowl, as Commissioner David Baker would hand the Founders Trophy to, as he put it,
to the City of Champions, the pro football capital of the world, to Woody Kern and Tim Markham of the Tampa Bay Storm.
It had taken them quite a while, but finally they could raise another championship banner and return to the top of arena football. Hopefully they enjoyed this moment. Hopefully they would savor it, because both the Storm and arena football would never reach these heights again. The fad was beginning to run its course, and over the next 5 years, the AFL empire would begin to crack. Heading into 2004, the Arena Football League, 19 teams strong, was basically on top of the world. Their influence had spread across the entire nation. Their games were being nationally broadcasted, and attendance was still looking strong after nearly 20 years. They even had their own video game on the PS2. What could go wrong? As the Storm prepared for the 2004 season, fresh off winning title number 5, they let go of Kaleo, Cohen, Smith, and more. But hey, Stafford is back, and luckily they still have Samuels and Solomon to try and compete for number 6. Things looked to be getting off on the right foot with a big win against Orlando, and they held the lead late against Georgia, but costly mistakes bit them in the end, as Stafford would fumble in the end zone to give the Force the win. Their struggles would continue against new expansion teams, and tough breaks against old foes, including Kaleo, who was now with the Austin Wranglers. After Week 10, the Storm sat at 3-7, with playoffs unlikely at best. Markham put it bluntly, "We've got to win the next 6, we're in sudden death right now." And what happened? They won the next 6, getting revenge on Kaleo, scraping together a win in Columbus, beating Orlando again, holding on against LA, and escaping with a close win after almost blowing it against New Orleans. And in the last game of the season against Dallas, a back-and-forth contest had the Storm up 59-41 with seconds left. However, the Desperados would score to cut the deficit to 2. On the two-pointer, quarterback Scott Dreisbach's pass was deflected back to himself, who tried to run it in, but he was stopped short, completing the comeback and sending the Storm back to the playoffs. Wowee guys, you kept the playoff streak alive, that's great. Too bad you came out like poopy shit against San Jose, getting outscored 35-6 in the first half. At least they made it interesting with 27 unanswered points in the fourth, but they couldn't finish it, and all that work to get here would amount to a first round exit. Well, at least it got there. The offseason would be marred with controversy, as Markham would be accused of falsifying insurance claims, and linebacker Darian Connor would be arrested for vehicular homicide, and would eventually be sentenced to 15 years in prison. And to top it off, several players from the 03 team would come out and accuse the Storm of using cubic zirconia instead of diamonds in their championship rings. It was at this point in writing the script that I learned the AFL actually gave out rings. But yeah, the Storm admitted they used fake diamonds in some of them, and even gave more to certain players based on their contributions. Even when they did add real diamonds to the rings, it still wasn't a good look for the supposed premier franchise of the AFL. Once again, in 2005, the Storm would struggle in the first half of the season, with 2 solid wins being met with an overtime loss against New Orleans and blowing chunks against Orlando. Isn't that great? They had their moments, like pulling out a 56-53 win against Arizona in a thriller that came down to a last-second field goal. But by the halfway point, they sat at 4-4. And to further complicate things, Markham and the team would be hit with salary cap violation fines for not accurately reporting payments to players. Markham would be suspended for 4 games, and the team would be delayed in signing free agents for 2 years. Even as Stafford would try and help his team out as they won 3 games in a row, Tolliver and Saunders would end up being traded. They were unable to clinch the division, but with wins against New York and Columbus, they got into the playoffs once again at 10-6. It was a season that saw them win every game at home, but go 2-6 on the road. And seeing as they had to travel for their first round, it wasn't a good sign. Sure enough, another first round exit was what awaited them, and it wasn't even close. And so we can say the Storm entered a bit of a lull period, as 2006 to 2008 saw the team at their lowest point. With Stafford still at the helm, they got out to a good start going 4-2 in 06. But after that, the wheels fell off, and they would be crushed in Dallas, and couldn't muster up anything against Georgia, San Jose, and Austin. And the less said about that obliteration against Orlando, the better. The defense, already on the downslide after 03, took a big hit in 06, posting the worst numbers in franchise history. And despite Stafford putting up a career year, the season ended with a whimper as they lost against Nashville. For the first time since moving to Tampa, the Storm would miss the playoffs. And to put the cherry on top, linebacker Bobby Scipio would criticize the team's play calling as the season came to an end. 2 days later, he was mysteriously put on waivers. 2007 started off even worse, as even though Stafford was gone, and even though they brought back Kaleo and Tolliver, the Storm lost their first 5 games in abysmal fashion. At least they were finally able to squeak out a win against New Orleans before getting shit on in Orlando again. Hi, Stafford! However, things would change with the introduction of rookie quarterback Brett Dietz, who took over in Columbus after Kaleo was injured. He would play well, leading his team to a win, and would throw 5 touchdowns the next week against Austin. Wins against LA and Arizona had them clawing their way back to 500, but they would once again have trouble in Georgia. But they persevered and would win out to make it back to the playoffs. Dietz would win co-Rookie of the Year, as he posted the highest quarterback in team history, and the young rookie would get his first taste of playoff action, as the Storm hosted the Columbus Destroyers. It was an intense bout, with the teams constantly trading scores. The Storm held the advantage in the first, but a pick 6 from Columbus had them overtake the lead in the second. Both teams remained tied at the half, and even deep into the fourth they still sat dead even, with Dietz throwing his 6th touchdown of the day. Kicker Seth Mahler would miss the extra point, which gave Columbus all the wiggle room they needed to get in front, as Matt Nagy would run it in to take the lead with 7 seconds left. Mahler had the chance to redeem himself, but his 56-yarder would sail wide, and just like that, the season was over. A heartbreaker for sure, but at least it gave this team some valuable experience, which they would hopefully use to build for the future. Which there hopefully will be one, as behind the scenes things were starting to get a little tumultuous. The league had lost their broadcasting partnership with NBC, and they were still losing money, with salaries increasing and available funds decreasing. They were towing the line of financial feasibility, but with a new contract with ESPN, they were at least able to push forward into 2008. They even had their own minor league to deal with, the AF2, which the AFL owned a majority stake in, and in a last-ditch effort to bring people in, they brought on John Elway and John Bon Jovi to be team owners? What? Yeah, believe it or not, this won't be the last time we see the AFL pull this stunt. There were lots of moving parts involved, but for the most part the 08 season went on without much of a hitch. As for the Storm, Kern would finally sell the team to Bob Nucci, and they would bring back Saunders to help the team return to relevance. Dietz would start strong again with 2 wins to start the year, including beating Georgia, but they would fall apart against New Orleans, giving up 34 points in the second, in a game that saw the defense allow the most points in franchise history. Their skid would continue as they lost the next 2. Then they basically gave the game away to Arizona with plenty of penalties. Their 5th straight loss against New York had them staring into another forgettable season, but nonetheless they pushed on. Finally, they were able to get through against Orlando, but a loss to Georgia had them sitting at 3-6 with 7 games left. In typical Storm fashion, they had a late-season surge, with them outlasting New Orleans late, forcing 6 turnovers against Grand Rapids, and a complete effort against Cleveland that saw them win game number 200 as a franchise. However, even though they had a lead late against Georgia, they would squander it with 2 quick scores to take over and win late. Even with a huge win against Orlando, their playoff hopes still hung perilously in the balance with 2 games left. They traveled to San Jose, where Dietz would struggle with 2 turnovers in the first half. However, he would respond with 3 more scores in the second, as he threw 10 touchdowns on the day. Holy shit. The offense would put up 70 points, which should have been enough to easily win. But once again, the defense shat themselves as they allowed 73 points to hand the game away, resulting in the Storm being eliminated from playoff contention for the second time in 3 years. As they defeated the LA Avengers to end the season, there was a sense of uncertainty in the air, as while this team had some great pieces, it still seemed like they were a few steps away from being true contenders. They had scored the most points in franchise history, with Dietz throwing 86 touchdowns and Torrance Marshall rushing for 23. but they also allowed the most points in franchise history. At least the team didn't really have anything to worry about on their home front, as they led the league in attendance, and enthusiasm was still high. I mean, shit, it's not like the Rays and Bucks were doing much better, and their co-tenants the Lightning were also coming off an underwhelming season. But their worries would soon be dwarfed, as just 2 days before the Arena Bowl, League Commissioner David Baker would unexpectedly retire, with no replacement being named. Ed Policy was named the interim commissioner as they continued their search to keep the league afloat. In October, they reportedly had a deal with Platinum Equity, who would purchase a $100 million stake in the league in exchange for streamlining operations to help make them more profitable. Seemed like a good move, although some owners didn't agree, namely Tom Benson of the New Orleans Voodoo, who announced the team would cease operations shortly after, most likely due to the deal. A dispersal draft was to be arranged for the New Orleans players, but the date was continually pushed back, leading to some worry about the league's stability. The players' union had to agree to cut the salary cap in hopes to prevent a total collapse, but the draft never happened, and the Platinum Equity investment also soon faded. And so, in December 2008, the owners would meet with the players' union and suspended the 2009 season, in hopes of reformatting the league for long-term stability and success. Progress was slow but steady, with Policy working with Columbus owner Jim Renacci. But in April 2009, he would step down, casting further doubt on the league's return. A month later, they missed the deadline to ratify a new CBA, and it was announced that health insurance for the players was cut. In July, the AFL, having owed $14 million to creditors, was considering bankruptcy. However, they still stubbornly pushed on, as on August 4th they announced that they were not folding. But the creditors would not back down, as they looked to force liquidation on the league, and a few days later their request would be granted. The dream of Jim Foster to create a new form of exciting football that would entertain the nation in the spring, that would revolutionize how we see the game, was officially killed on August 26, 2009, as the league would shut down indefinitely. They lasted much longer than anyone thought. 22 years is still mighty impressive for a spring football startup, but it was over. The Storm would not get their chance to build themselves up for title number 6. They couldn't get even with Orlando, as they would lose their rivalry 22-21, though at least they won their last 2 matchups. On this day, the Tampa Bay Storm and the Greater Arena Football League were laid to rest. But this is not the end of this story, as while the AFL had ceased operations, the AF2 continued on, and even played a full 2009 season. Seeing as their parent league had shut down, the two decided to meet to discuss the future of arena football. The 2009 AF2 season saw them field 25 teams, mostly in smaller cities, but they also included some familiar faces like the Iowa Barnstormers and Albany Firebirds. But now these AF2 owners and former AFL owners would be working together, as they agreed to form a new league, Arena Football 1. On November 11th, they announced their intention to purchase all assets of the old AFL, including all teams. They already had some on their side, with the Predators and Rattlers joining the new league, but the status of the Storm was still up in the air. In December, they were awarded those assets, and a couple months later, the new league, now rebranding itself as the second iteration of the AFL, was ready to take off. With 16 teams, a combination of AFL and AF2 markets, they looked to start a new season, with reduced payrolls in an effort to keep them from bleeding money. Of course, there was concern that players would jump ship to the NFL at the first chance they got, but it was at least an opportunity to give arena football another try. However, the Storm were not one of the teams included in the new league, as negotiations pressed on between them and league officials. But with the new league owning pretty much everything, they were eventually brought on board, with Markham and some former players returning as well. They had new owners in the Tampa Bay Storm Partners LLC, and they headlined the AFL's return in 2010. But as we'll see, this is not the same team that they once were. The Tampa Bay Storm of old were gone for good, and the new Storm only lived as a mockery of their legacy, as arena football tried once again to recapture the minds of the American people.